Tyler Buckheit, and I really like John Deere plows. I get a lot of questions from people wanting to know how to do some basic plow repairs, and been wanting to do this for a while. The enclosed clutch that you see on this model 50 or 22 plow was the same clutch essentially that was used on a number of different plows, including a 4B, 4C, 4D, 55, 57, 44, among several others, and other similar styles such as a 66 and a 77. But this is strictly concerning the smaller axle enclosed clutches. Very common problem, that the folks tell me that they pull the lever with their trip rope and nothing happens. There's an internal spring most likely broken in a case like that. If your lever pulls forward but doesn't return, there's a return spring on this clutch that can break. It actually sits right in here. There's one adjustment on this clutch, and one only, is this bolt right here. This threads into a plug at the end of a spring inside of here, which attaches to an arm from this lever. You can only tighten this up. If you loosen this, most likely the plug will have threaded out of the spring, and as everything is loose inside, the only way to correct the problem is to disassemble the clutch and reattach. Sometimes the spring breaks, so if you can spin this freely with your hand and there's nothing connected, that's one of two problems. That's a fairly common thing. About the only other problem you run into on an enclosed clutch like this is that the grease inside is caked and crusty and doesn't allow the parts to move the way that they should. Originally, this would have used like a heavy gear lube, something equivalent to say 140 weight oil or even heavier. But today, it's really best to go back with a high quality grease, which I'll talk about later. So what we're going to do today is disassemble this clutch. I'm going to show you how to take the wheel off, disassemble the clutch, and go into it and assess parts, and show you what's available, replacement parts today. Square hardware can sometimes be a challenge. Although it tends not to rust solid and twist off bolts, it can still be rusty. 8-point sockets are really nice if you do much work on a plow. This one, these caps always take a 13/16. Most of your large bolts on the frame take a 15/16, and the large nuts for those 5/8 bolts are 1 inch. If you wanted to order square 8-point sockets, you can find them on Amazon and eBay. So, we've got the bolts loose. Our cap is loose, and look what we find. Well, it's a good sign to find some grease. You don't always find grease. And I forgot a rag. Okay, what we are searching for is a pin. Right there is the head of a pin. So, what we need to do is drive that pin out. And the pin only goes one way. The reason the pin only goes one way, it's got a head made onto it, like so. It's a headed pin, and it's tapered at the head, so it can only go in one direction. So once you've got that loose, you can take the adjusting collar off and the washers behind it. Nice and greasy, which is certainly a good thing. There's also a gasket right here. Sometimes these are really stuck on, sometimes they just pop right off depending on the surface. And we can even see some original yellow paint. You want to know what your wheel looked like before it got rusty? There we go. So, sometimes there's washers sliding on the end of this shaft. So, you look at this and you may think, oh, I need to put a puller. This is the end of the axle right here. I need to put a puller on there. Pull the wheel off. All you'll do is push this axle further in. What we actually have to push against is this. This is part of a hollow sleeve that's essentially the axle bearing. This piece is the male taper into the female taper of this hub. the hub has to come off this way. So what we'll have to do is get a piece of flat metal, set it in here, taking a large sledgehammer and giving it several good strong hits, very strong, that being the key word, and knocking that loose. Once that happens, the wheel comes off, then we can disassemble further. Alright, so I should also mention that we blocked up our plow frame so that nothing can fall down on us. Very important. Think safety, people. Nobody needs to get injured working on their plow if they can help it. So, I've taken the bolts out of the housing. Everything's loose on this end. We're going to go ahead and pull our housing apart. Notice there's water started to drip out. That's a very common thing. Don't be alarmed by seeing that. Okay, now we are inside of our gear case. Based on the bolts, they appear unadulterated, I'm going to surmise that this clutch hasn't been apart since it left the plow works in sometime in the 50s. So, now that we've got this in place, it kind of shows you how the clutch works. You know, that your clutch lever is attached to this arm, or this arm here. And the spring return pressure that I was telling you about earlier, this bolt threads right into this spring right here. So if we want to increase the tension, we simply would tighten this up. Now, it would appear that based on the relationship between the nut and the housing and into the spring, there's really no adjustment left. It's stretched out. You can see the rust pitting on the spring. It's not going to be long before this would break. So the reason you want to go into these is to avoid getting to the field on plow day thinking your clutch is great, and then you make one pass and your spring breaks inside and your fun times are over. So it really pays to go through your clutch ahead of time. And as you engage, you have a spring-loaded roller right here. There's the other spring inside of your clutch right here, and it holds this roller tight in the end of this cog or arm. And this roller engages these teeth, and it's got a slot such that if you back up, it just simply slips the clutch like an overriding clutch. But if you go forward, it pulls it down with the spring tension into the cog, and it makes this whole mechanism spin inside here. Once it's done a full turn, it comes all the way around to the other side, engaging the roller at the end of this arm, and it stops. So it turns half the way around. So your plow should lift in a half revolution if everything is right. So we'll go ahead and disassemble, because we want to make sure everything is right here. It's certainly a good sign to see grease and not a lot of rust in our clutch. So from here, we can go ahead and pull this off, our whole clutch assembly. It will come off. Sometimes it might get marred at the end of the axle. Important to note, the reason that this axle never can come out of this housing is there's a keyway right here. This is keyed to the housing, but the key it's got a blind spot, so it can't go any further than this washer. And your keyway doesn't run all the way to the end of the axle, so therefore your axle can't come out without disassembling and taking this key apart. So for our purpose, we're going to take all this apart. We're going to clean up our pieces. We're going to replace our springs, our dust seals, and so on. We're also going to be disconnecting our axle from the lifting strap, but when I do that, I'm going to have to support this axle because it's going to want to drop from the plow frame. Okay, so we got some things cleaned up. A little wash pan and some solvent. Taking parts off. And if you want to take the axle out, once you've removed the key, you can slide the axle all the way out for cleaning purposes. I would advise doing that just to make sure everything's good and clean. And I'll do that in a little bit. So, normally, this lever is riveted onto the lever and this arm are riveted together. In this case, there was actually nothing holding this arm on. Of course, it can't go anywhere because it's sandwiched between both housings. But you'll notice the hole here and the hole here. It's actually meant to rivet, and it is keyed to the shaft. And in this case, it's common to find these rollers with flat spots or worn spots. It's really nothing to worry about. That's not severe. It's not just not worth worrying about. Something you want to clean up. We'll do that in a bit. Now, I want to talk specifically about this spring. So to remove this spring from the housing, you're going to take a pair of pliers. In a lot of cases, whatever was broken, you'll have to hang on to the piece with a pair of pliers. And I can simply take the bolt out. This is what controls your tension on the lever for the lever return. So the tighter you make this, the tighter the spring is. Now, a spring like this, with all this rust pitting, it's just a ticking time bomb. It's a matter of time before it breaks internally. You don't want that to happen when you're in the field or at plow day. So we'll be replacing that with new. Now that we've got basically our housing cleaned up, we can start with the reassemble. We're going to be replacing our clutch lever with a brand new one. We'll be replacing springs, we'll be replacing shim washers, gaskets, and seals. So now that we've laid out our parts for our repair, we've got our gasket kit here, which is a spring kit. This kit is available on eBay. If you search John Deere clutch or plow clutch, you'll be able to find this on eBay. This lever is available separately on eBay as well. So the lever is not always needed, but in this case we're going to put a new one in because the old one does have some wear, not to mention some rust pitting. Other things we'll need for this: carb cleaner or brake cleaner, I prefer for gasket surfaces. Gasket dressing, this is my favorite by far. You can use silicone if you choose to, but I find that silicone is very prone to leaking if you don't get things just perfect. And 1 tube of cornhead grease. You can buy this from John Deere, you can buy it from Case IH. Those two dealers I know have it available. But it's basically a semi-solid grease that, at normal room temperature is sort of semi-solid, but as soon as it warms up, it liquefies. It's used in gearboxes on corn heads. It's also used in gearboxes on rotary mowers and bush hogs. So for this application, it works very well, and it stays inside the clutch housing where we want it. So this is the plug that I removed from the old spring. Easiest way to get this out is to put this plug down in a vise and then take a pair of channel locks or large pliers and try to twist the spring off of the plug. If you try to twist the plug out, it wants to tighten on itself like a noose. So old spring, new spring. And new spring, simply put it in a vise, thread this in until it runs out until the coil stops at the end of the threads. Okay, so before we can reassemble, we've got to get a few things in order, such as installing a new felt seal, which goes inside of our outer housing. Your original felt seal is usually pretty well worn. This one is one of the most intact that I've ever seen. Simply wipe out the groove where your felt goes. We have pre-soaked our felt with oil, just a 30 weight oil or any appropriate grade engine oil will fit just fine. And your felt should just tuck right in like so. We'll smear a little bit of grease on it just to make sure that the axle bearing slides in just like you want it to. Okay, we've got that done. We'll prep our gasket surfaces with a dangle grinder and get everything nice and clean, ready for our gasket. But prior to that, we'll go ahead and work on installing our new spring along with our bolt. Wherever the bolt went. Nothing like working on the floor. Also should mention, this little spring, you might not think it's worth replacing, and then you remove the old one and you see that the coils are nearly worn in half from rubbing against this hub. So just something to bear in mind. We can go ahead and start our reassembly to this degree, putting our washer here. We'll put our keyway into the keyway, like so. And then we will install our new shaft. Like so. install our arm. Then we can work on finding the hole, which we will rivet. It's there somewhere. There we are. And what we'll do is simply take a hammer and smash this in so that the lever could never pull out. Otherwise, the lever could potentially pull out during use. So we're going to set the rivet that holds the arm onto our lever, simply using a bucking bar. Got the sledgehammer, in case you're wondering, up against the muscle of my leg. Just going to tap it and smash the end. It's a soft rivet. It's just simply enough so that it won't, your lever can't come out when you're using the plow, as that would not be a good thing. So when you put our lever return spring on, first there's a little hook back here. You can sort of slip it right around. Slip it right around our lever. And if everything works right on a nice day. There we go, it just slips right over the top. We take our bolt and simply thread it into our spring. Just like a brand new one. So, next step is, we've already got our washer on here. Our next step is slide our drum, if you will, back on. And we've checked this out to make sure everything moves freely. You want to check for wear on the rivet areas that are kind of welded together. These are welded together. That's not really a service part. I guess you could cut the weld and repair if you had to, but we'll go ahead, put just a little bit of grease on here. We'll go ahead and slide this into place. Get our keyway lined up. Slide it so far, and then we'll have to engage our lever so that it holds everything where we want it. Everything looks good. The roller's engaged in our arm just the way we like it. See what happens when we engage our roller. Everything turns fine. Okay, next we're going to use one of the new washers, the heavier, thicker washer that we had. This is the washer that shims the moving versus the non-moving. The only time this all turns in lockstep is when we're lifting or lowering our clutch. Grease in place. Then we can slide our sleeve all in here, like so. So if you really want to see how this wheel works, your wheel is spinning all the time. This is just freewheeling. This is just the bearing, and your wheel is spinning all the time. As soon as you trip the lever, you can sort of see in slow motion what happens. And it goes halfway around, and then it locks back in place, and it disconnects the roller from our hub, allowing the plow just to keep freewheeling. And you trip again to raise the plow, trip again to lower the plow. So what we're going to do from here is smear as much grease as we can in the housing as we put it back on. We'll try to get the whole tube if we're... Okay, we've taken our tube of cornhead grease and smeared as much as possible on top of the assembly, and most of the rest of the tube down in the bottom of the housing, taking care not to get it on the gasket surface. We prepped our gasket surfaces with sealant, as well as put the gasket on our housing to make it simple. Put 2 bolts in place just to keep the gasket from falling down. So I'm going to carefully and quickly install this. And you'll have to sort of squeeze it in place using a back and forth pattern, because that felt seal is fairly tight. And you may have to wiggle this to get the end of the shaft in place as well. Okay. And your bolts on this have to go from this side out because basically being a square head bolt, they're held in place like so. We'll do that and button up our housing. Okay, we've got our housing back together, everything's bolted tight into place. Just making sure everything spins freely as it does. Now there'll be a lot of friction now because your felt seal is brand new as you would expect. But that's a dust seal, it keeps water and dust and dirt out. So the next step is installing our sand collar. Now I've had this one cleaned up and painted, ready to go with my new wheels. My plan for this plow is to get it in good working order and then actually do a restoration. But you need to have good wheels to be able to use the plow. So I slid the collar on and I turned it 90 degrees so that it lines up with the bolts line up with the tapers on the hub. And then we'll go ahead and install our grease tube, if you will, which is not too hard to do, but that's what actually greases your axle shaft, and it's something you should probably grease every couple years, to be honest. It's not anything that is real critical. There's also a grease zerk on the inside as well to grease the axle shaft on here. Now, a lot of people think that these grease fittings will grease into the gear case, and I suppose this one will with everything in place. This grease fitting, you could actually put grease into the gearbox that way, albeit somewhat slow. Okay, so here we've got our clutch drive wheel. Had my rim repaired by Detweiler up in Wisconsin, and we got a new traction lug tire. Notice the treads on the tire are going reverse because this is a ground-driven implement up and down. Your treads need to be facing the way in which the load is going to be applied. Something else to note, there's a notch in the back of this hub for this grease tube. You've got to have everything lined up there. So taking great care to do that, and to start the bolts in the proper spot, sort of a three-handed operation. I think all my bolts are in position, and then it's simply sliding the wheel on. Now, from here, we will be putting our shim washers back into place like we had done earlier. We'll turn our adjusting collar so that it's like that in the position that we want. And we've got our drive pin, or our little keeper pin, just nice and snug there. Just make sure that it engages both sides. So, with that in place, and I've used the rest of my grease and put it in my outer cap, installed my seal, my gasket, we're ready to install our cap. Like so. And then we simply install lock washers and our nuts onto each one, and it will then tighten up our wheel and hub. It will actually pull everything together, sandwich it together, because once again this is a tapered fit. Alright, so we've got our wheel tight, it's installed. There's very little in play on the axle and the wheel, just like we want it. It's not tight or binding, and as soon as the rest of the plow is in good shape, we can take it to the field. But this will give you an idea how to rebuild an enclosed clutch used on John Deere plows since about 1940 up into the late 50s, and actually even the early mid-60s. So hopefully that helps and cleared up some questions you might have had.